Welcome to the Speaking of History lecture series. I'm at Heritage Village. My name is Heather Culligan, and I'm the operations manager here at Heritage Village. And I will lead today's program entitled From the Collection with Love and a Little History. Now today we're going to dive into the museum collection at Heritage Village and explored some of the objects that captivated my heart immediately from the beginning. Of course, if I were to share everything from our collection, we'd be here all afternoon, right? And we simply can't do that, unfortunately. But I'm hopeful that you'll leave here today with a better understanding of our museum collection and maybe a fun story or two to share with your friends and family. So, now when most people think of Heritage Village, they may think of our lovely blue sign that sits right out there on 125th Street, welcoming visitors from near and far into our park. We're a Pinellas County park that includes a living history museum, exhibit galleries, and a library and archives. Visitors may also think of our buildings when you think about Heritage Village. Perhaps the H.C. Smith store comes to mind, welcoming visitors into the old-fashioned store interior, our antique cars in the back, the post office, the barber shop that sits up front, and of course the Coca-Cola beverages that are available for purchase. Or maybe you think of the 1896 Plant Sumner House with its inviting front porch and its educational interactive parlor that's just inside those doors. Others may remember the Low House, a personal favorite of mine, that while not furnished, still gives you a sense of what life was like in the 1880s when it was built. And it may also pose a challenge for visitors seeking entry to the house that has 4 doors, but only 2 are actually unlocked for our visitors. Some may also remember the Williams Park Bandstand that represents community and a gathering place for all. You may have listened to music performed under its shingled roof, or maybe you stepped up yourself to admire the hand-turned spindles that anchor the railing. The caboose is always a favorite for all visitors, even though it's not open yet. It is closed for restoration, but visitors are often seen examining it up close, taking photographs, discussing what it might look like inside. Or maybe you remember more than the exteriors, and I hope you do, but maybe the interior of the Boyer Cottage, for example, sticks in your mind because while it's small in size, it's abundant in charm and character. The kitchens in some of our homes are always memorable. From the stoves or from the early handheld kitchen tools, it provides an opportunity for visitors to reminisce and discuss with their family and friends. Dining rooms offer a glimpse into a time when families sat down for dinner together without the distraction of television and cell phones. Or perhaps visitors remember the bedrooms in the Plant Sumner House. The layout is pretty similar to modern homes of today. There's 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom upstairs on the 2nd floor. But the carpentry detail and the furnishings reflect a much earlier time. Other visitors may remember the display cases in the exhibit galleries that feature a selection of artifacts from the museum collection, including tourism artifacts that some of you may actually have at home from your travels across the state. And sometimes these cases are memorable because you ask yourself, what is that and what in the world was it used for? And maybe a select number of visitors may even know about our wonderful library and archives that holds this wonderful collection. This is actually the collection of our city directories, and they hold really valuable historical information about past residents and businesses. Now, my purpose for this mini tour of Heritage Village is to show you what visitors think of when I say, I work at Heritage Village, or, oh, I hear people say, I visited Heritage Village. And their minds automatically go to all of these things we discussed, and that's definitely not a bad thing. But I can assure you that when someone recalls their visit to Heritage Village, they do not remember this. Rows and rows of acid-free, adhesive-free record center boxes that hold both the museum and archival collection here at Heritage Village. Now, everyone, please contain your excitement. I know these guys are really more exciting than the caboose. Well, I will admit they are actually very exciting for me. I get really excited about these boxes and their contents. And I'm hoping that by the end of our little chat today, that you'll be just as excited. But let's back up, though, a little bit about me. A little over a year ago, I was in Atlanta. That's me in the black shirt there, removing extremely heavy plaster-casted Union and Confederate soldiers from the Atlanta cyclorama. When one day my husband came to me and said, how do you feel about Florida? I was like, well, I thought about that, and fast forward a few months, and I found myself accepting a brilliant and exciting position of curator of collections here at Heritage Village. And that's how I started here. And I got to see this view every time I walked out of my office. And I can tell you it's really nice. And like our visitors, I immediately fell in love with everything. Our buildings, the exhibits, our wonderful volunteers. And I also find myself really falling in love with the collection that we have here at Heritage Village, including everything inside those acid-free boxes. I realized two things about the museum collection. We have really great stuff, and two, visitors don't realize we have a collection that you can't see. And so when I was approached about participating in the Speaking of History lecture series, I wanted to take the opportunity to share with all of you items I love about our collection. The collection, and right now when I say the collection, I mean the museum and the library and archives collection, at Heritage Village is the product of a unique and beneficial relationship between Pinellas County and the Pinellas County Historical Society, which became an official relationship in 1976. PCHS, or Pinellas County Historical Society, has an agreement with the county that, among other things, outlines the care and preservation of the collection. PCHS owns this collection, owns the title to everything, and the county, through Heritage Village staff, cares for and preserves this collection. The library and archives collections includes about 9,000 photographic images, thousands of postcards and documents, rare books, and the museum collection includes about 20,000 objects. The museum collection includes all types of collections like textiles, furniture, decorative arts, and household items. Children's toys, tools and farm equipment, lots of tools and farm equipment, my friends, and military uniforms as well. So as you can see, we collect a wide variety of objects for the museum collection. And when I talk about the museum collection, I primarily get asked two questions. What do we collect, and why is it in storage? To answer the first question, what do we collect objects that pertain to Pinellas County history, its people, its buildings. The collections policy, as we call it, links directly to the mission of Heritage Village, which is to collect, preserve, and interpret Pinellas County history within the context of Florida history, which you can see I tried to demonstrate that with lovely maps. It's specific for a reason. Our mission at Heritage Village is very clearly defined. Why we exist is very clearly defined. And in order to fulfill that mission, we need objects that aid us in telling that specific history. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have things in our collection that don't pertain to Pinellas County. I will admit that our collections focus, our narrow focus, was adopted probably in the early 2000s, and like I said, we've had a nice relationship since 1976. So there are things in our collection that don't necessarily come from Pinellas County, but they still are valuable nonetheless. Now, there are a few answers to the second question of why is it in storage? Well, if you've been paying attention, you know that our sole mission at Heritage Village is not to simply collect things to put in our buildings, right? That's certainly part of it. Interpreting the history of Pinellas County requires that we collect items that help us interpret the lives of people who lived in these buildings, who used these buildings. But the other part, an equally important part to that, of our mission is to preserve Pinellas County history. We do that with our buildings and our collections. We're here to preserve Pinellas County history for future generations and to ensure that the stories we share at Heritage Village can be told with objects from that time period. So that's the big fancy answer. Now, other less exciting answers include, well, we have multiple examples of items and we need to put them somewhere. For example, sewing machines. We have sewing machines in our structures. The backups, where do they live? They live in collection storage. Future exhibitions and interpretations require us to collect now and interpret later. The Turner Bungalow is a great example of that. We also have limited gallery space. We have 2 exhibit galleries. And we also have limited space in our buildings. We don't want to crowd our buildings with stuff to where you can't enjoy them. Conservation reasons, some things aren't stable enough to go out on display. And there are security concerns as well. And plus, I always like to say that we can keep things in storage. I can make you feel special by giving you a behind-the-scenes tour at some point. So there's that bonus as well. So, what do I love from the museum collection at Heritage Village? Well, I've selected 4 objects, and there are little objects interspersed within those 4 stories that we'll talk about. And it was really hard for me to choose only 4, to be honest with you. I had a whole list, and I had to narrow it down because, like I said, we'd be here all day. But I felt that these 4 had interesting stories to tell, stories that I wanted to share with all of you. So with that, object number 1 is a 1911 Franklin sewing machine, which was owned by Margaret Nancy Ann Nanny McMullen Hardage. The sewing machine can be seen on the left, while Nanny is seen on the right, and the photograph of Nanny is about 1900. The sewing machine was donated to Heritage Village in 2015 by a descendant of Nanny McMullen. And like many objects we receive, the sewing machine showed its age. Over the years, it had accumulated layers of dust and rust and paint to its wood finish. One side of the wood cabinet had been painted white at some point. The wood veneer top was cracked and peeling all along the top. The detail of the sewing machine itself could not be seen, and it also was non-operational. It was seized up, essentially. Needless to say, it looked 114 years old. And a few folks questioned the sanity of those fighting to include it in the collection, but we saw its potential for sure. The picture you see now is what it currently looks like. From a curatorial standpoint, I wanted to clean it up, not make it look new. That's not what we do in the museum field. We don't erase its physical history, but rather stabilize it so that it doesn't deteriorate further. The end product, as you can see, is quite miraculous. We were able to remove the paint safely without damaging the wood. We stabilized the veneer top to prevent further peeling and cracking, and we removed all traces of dust and rust. Not only did we reveal the physical beauty of the sewing machine, but we brought to life an object with a pretty incredible story. This was an opportunity, I felt, to share a story with our visitors that otherwise wasn't being told. So, what was a Franklin sewing machine? When we think of sewing machines, one may draw the Singer sewing machine to mind, right? It's typically the most well-known, the most popular sewing machine brand. The Franklin sewing machine was manufactured by the Domestic Sewing Machine Company, and it was sold by Sears, Roebuck & Company. And the Franklin sewing machine copied the Singer sewing machine with its gold Egyptian design and its cabinet base. Sears, Roebuck and Company really changed the consumer market by offering affordable household items that competed with large manufacturers such as the Singer Manufacturing Company. So the consumer would flip through the catalog, they would order their Franklin sewing machine, and it would arrive with an instruction manual that you see here. And this is a photograph of the 1911 sewing machine manual. The manual included step-by-step instructions for use and diagrams, such as this one, that identified parts of the machine. Now, amazingly, when we started opening all the drawers of Nanny's sewing machine, guess what was inside? The manual. It was amazing, and it was very exciting. I totally had a geek out moment over that. In addition, there were other surprises in the sewing machine. There were attachments for the sewing machine, which you see on the right. The metal box includes roughly 9 attachments that were fairly good condition, really. And on the left, you'll see a close-up of the sewing machine itself. Now, importantly, look at the Egyptian design I mentioned earlier. It's faint, but it's still there nonetheless. And the design is a prime example of stabilizing rather than making it look new. If we were to make this design look new, we would compromise the historical integrity of the object. While mass-produced, these sewing machine designs are an art in itself. We don't see this kind of detail and artwork on appliances today. Could you imagine if your refrigerator had this nice like gold leaf design? Therefore, because it's art, it needs to be preserved. And on a side note, the machine still functions, and you can see that we put a little piece of fabric in there. Well, we wouldn't use it to sew anything, of course. It's a museum artifact, but its ability to operate at 116 years old is pretty magnificent. I wish we could all operate fully at 116, right? Now, as you can tell, the Franklin sewing machine really caught my eye, and perhaps it's because it stood in the back of a storage room, completely secure, of course, but in desperate need of love. Or perhaps it's because I knew it had a vague connection to the McMullen family. Either way, I was intrigued. And once it had been cleaned up and stabilized, and once I figured out its manufacture history, I desperately wanted to know more about its history with the McMullen family. And as the new kid on the block from Georgia, it presented me a great opportunity to learn about one of the most well-known families in Pinellas County. So who was Nanny McMullen? Nanny was born in Pinellas County in about 1865. She was the 6th child of 9 total to Daniel and Margaret Ann McMullen, as you can see there. Daniel and Margaret Ann owned land that eventually grew to about 200 acres here in the Largo area. And the house Daniel McMullen built on that property, of course, is now here at Heritage Village. And Nanny lived most of her life in that home until her death in 1957. In my efforts to learn more about Nanny, the woman who owned this great Franklin sewing machine, I ventured right behind me into the Heritage Village Library and Archives. And there I found a tremendous collection of letters from the McMullen family, several of which were to and from Nanny. And I've included some examples here. Now, I will admit, I hoped to find a mention of like sewing or mending or maybe even the Franklin sewing machine. I did not. But I still found great information and a glimpse into Nanny's life, into the life of her family and her friends. One of the earliest letters seen here is written December of 1894, and it's from James Hardage to Nanny. Now, spoiler alert, James and Nanny later marry, but at this point, they're friends, maybe they're courting, although they don't ever say that. They don't say, you know, dear person, I'm courting, but you kind of get the impression that they're more to each other. And he references in this particular letter other letters that they've already exchanged to each other. his work at the sawmill, and maybe a potential visit to the Largo area at Christmas, which he hopes to be able to do so he can visit Nanny. He also mentions that it's a beautiful afternoon, and I quote, "I do wish I was with you so we could sit under the orange trees on the grass. How nice it would be." The second letter you see up there was written in August of 1899, and it's from Nanny to James. She begins, and I quote, "My dear boy, at last the company is all gone, and have a few minutes to spend with you before time to fix supper." She recounts her day, relays news about the family and friends there, and shares with him that she hopes he visits her at the Springs in the next few days. Here are some other letters. The letter on the left is dated September 1899, and maybe my favorite in the collection, although the second one that we're going to talk about is a close second here. It's from Nanny to James, written on a Sunday afternoon, and I quote, "My dear boy, I am sitting up in Lover's Oak, and if you were only here, what a nice time we would have." She talks about the beautiful yellow birds, the high tide, the young boys that were playing in the bay. And she paints quite a beautiful picture of the Lover's Oak area, which is now the Safety Harbor area. And the photograph you see at the center is of Lover's Oak about 1905. The final letter I've included here is undated, and it's written from Nanny to James. And she's a little down in this letter, I will tell you, because she hasn't seen James in 4 weeks, and it's going to be another 4 weeks until she gets to see him again. And she writes, and I quote, "Ella Blakely just asked me why I did look so serious, that I had no sweetheart or husband to leave. I told her mine had not come was why I was sad." Interestingly, she recounts a few stories of young men coming to visit her and her friends. For example, she states, and I quote, "There are a couple of young men over here in a boat from St. Petersburg and offered to take us all out sailing, but I refused to go, so none of them went." She discusses 3 men that came to visit their wives and brought a bottle of wine, which apparently the couples enjoyed. She states, and I quote, "Don't you know their wives enjoyed their visit? Do you wonder why I hate the stuff? I would rather be put in my grave tomorrow than be tied to a man that had no more respect for me than that." So you have to admire a woman with strong beliefs and opinions. It's clear from this last letter that Nanny and James really cared for each other deeply. And the letter goes on to discuss her joy upon finally receiving a letter from him and how, and I quote, "it made my heart unusually light." So Nanny and James, as I mentioned earlier, they were married January 2nd, 1902. He worked in the sawmill industry, and he moved the sawmill closer to the Largo area. And Nanny herself spent much of her adult life caring for others. In the mid-1870s, her mother fell ill after the birth of her 9th and final child, and from then on, Nanny took care of her 3 younger brothers. And then in 1908, Nanny and James cared for her brother Charles's children, 6 children, after the death of his first wife. Now this photograph shows James and Nanny on the left, with Daniel McMullen on the far right. The 2 young children, we believe, are George and Robert McMullen, who were sons of her brother Charles and his second wife, Maddie. Her niece, Nanny McMullen McLaughlin, who was raised by Nanny, lived in the house, in the McMullen house that I mentioned earlier, and actually donated it to Heritage Village in 1992. The letters and the sewing machine followed years later, and most recently we received an autograph book that belonged to Nanny McMullen. After learning about the sewing machine itself and the life of its owner, I decided to put it back where it belonged, in the McMullen house, where it currently is today, on display so visitors can learn about Nanny and her story. Now, the second object I love is this 1930s women's work dress. And this dress was owned by Matilda Clark. I love this dress for a few reasons. Probably the most exciting reason for me is that it's a work dress. Typically, we don't save the everyday items, right? We save the finer things, like our Sunday best, our wedding dresses. And it's usually because they would have cost a lot of money. They were made of finer things, and we take care of them. We preserve them better. Everyday items are harder to collect because they don't survive the wear and tear of everyday life. And typically, people will toss them, throw them away, and replace them with something else. So the fact that we have a work dress from the 1930s in our collection is pretty spectacular to me. The dress itself is cotton with a floral pattern, mainly red and white, and it's on a green fabric. And it has 10 buttons on the front and 2 pockets, which I love. And on the right, you'll see a photograph of Matilda Clark and a cow. I don't know the cow's name. She's unidentified, I guess. And they're at the Oak Grove Dairy in Clearwater. Now, Matilda, seen on the right, was born in 1869 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. She met a nice young man named Alfred Clark. He's on the left, also in Pittsburgh, and they married in 1891. And they had 4 children. Now, one of those children, Amber Elizabeth Clark, is of particular importance to us at Heritage Village. Amber Elizabeth married Alfred Turner in 1913. They had 2 children, and they lived in the most adorable bungalow here in Clearwater, which is now known as the Turner Bungalow, and it's here at Heritage Village. Now, going back to Matilda, her and her husband Alfred moved to the Clearwater area about 1911. And Alfred worked various farms in the area, and in 1940, we find evidence that he's working on a dairy farm. The image you see on the right is from the 1940 United States Census of the Clearwater area, specifically the area of Drew Street. And while it's hard to see, the area circled in yellow includes the names of Alfred and Matilda Clark. The census, I think, is a great source of information when doing research. For example, this one census offers us a lot of information about Alfred and Matilda. It tells us their education levels, their current ages. They were both 70 years old at this point. Their place of birth, their occupations, their address in 1935, which is unique to the 1940 census. They told us where they were living in between the census, which is really great. And it even tells us how many hours Alfred worked that day, or that week, excuse me. Now, even though the census was taken, or the census taker didn't list hours worked for Matilda, Alfred, it says up there that Alfred actually worked 56 hours that week, which is tremendous. It doesn't list anything for Matilda. Now, I'm pretty sure she wasn't just hanging out, doing nothing. She most certainly was working at the dairy in some capacity. Anyone who's ever owned or worked on a farm knows that everybody pitches in to get the work done. So as I mentioned, this census states that they are actually working at the Oak Grove Dairy. Alfred is the co-owner of Oak Grove at this point, and they lived there also in 1935, so we know that for at least the last 5 years they've been working on this dairy. The milk bottle you'll see on the left is one of 2 bottles we have in the collection from Oak Grove Dairy. Both bottles are in excellent shape and were received as part of the Turner collection when we acquired the Turner Bungalow and its contents. These guys were hanging out inside. In addition to the bottles, we have a jug and a 15-gallon crock storage container from the Oak Grove Dairy. And these were donated with the dress to Heritage Village. They came as a bundled package. These are great examples of storage containers that were used by farmers, not only here in Pinellas County, but across Florida, across the Southeast. They're very common. And the crock seen on the left has a blue crown marking with the number 15 at the center. The number, of course, indicates the gallon size, but the crown gives us a clue about the manufacturer. The container is believed to be made by the Robinson Ramsbottom Pottery, say that 5 times fast, company out of Ohio. The 5-gallon jug is manufactured by a different company, and we know that because it has a different marking. It's a blue star logo on the front. And it's possible that it was made by the Star Stoneware Company out of Crooksville, Ohio. But I will admit I don't know that for sure. We need to do a little more research. Believe it or not, there are a lot of pottery companies that use a blue star as their logo. So Matilda herself, Matilda Clark, dies in 1961 in Clearwater. And Alfred follows her shortly thereafter in 1965. Matilda's work dress is significant to the collection in so many ways, but what I love about it is its perceived simplicity. To outsiders, it's a simple dress. What could possibly be exciting about a women's work dress? But it tells the story of a woman who worked alongside her husband on farms for years. Even up until the age of 70, she's still working on a dairy farm with the unnamed cow that we saw in the picture. The photographs, the milk bottles, the pottery only add to an already fascinating story. And to complete the picture, we have the home lived in by her daughter and her family at Heritage Village today. Now, the next object I'd like to talk about is an object that came to my attention from my work with one of our volunteers. We were working on identifying objects in the collection that were unique and documenting the object's purpose and how it functioned. Now, that may not sound like an exciting project to some of you, but I was really excited about this. I think it's important for us as museum professionals to know and understand how certain objects functioned. Why? Well, we need to know how it worked and what it was used for in order to interpret it, right? We can't just guess and put it on display and say, well, we think it's this, but we don't actually know how it worked. And I think it gives us a great history of a certain type of object and how it has evolved over time. It provides great insight into the minds of people who were attempting to make jobs easier and more efficient over time. So what object am I talking about? Well, this guy is an 1880s Hall typewriter. Now, you'll immediately notice that it doesn't look like a modern typewriter, right? It's missing a key feature, a keyboard. So let's learn more about him. Thomas Hall, who is the inventor of the Hall typewriter, he's the handsome devil on the left. He was an engineer from Brooklyn, New York. And he received a patent for his typewriter March 1st, 1881, almost 136 years ago. The image on the right is from the patent file at the US Patent Office. His typewriter was known as an index typewriter, and Mr. Hall became one of the first people to successfully produce the index typewriter. Our particular typewriter was manufactured sometime between 1881 and 1887. How do I know that? I'm not psychic. I do have a reason. Well, there's a plate on the front of the machine that gives you the manufactured location. So that's a good start. In this case, it says New York. Now, our research tells us that the Hall Typewriter Company manufactured typewriters in 3 areas: New York, Salem, and Boston. The years that the company operated in these cities is also well documented. So therefore, if we know that the company was in New York between 1881 and 1887, and we know it was manufactured in New York based on the plate, then obviously we know that our typewriter was manufactured sometime between 1881 and 1887. Our particular Hall model comes in a wooden portable case, and it's very light. You could take it with you wherever you wanted to. This model would have cost about $40 in its day, which was less than the cost of a standard typewriter. The model could also be purchased with additional accessories if you needed it, including additional plates that could be added for $1 each. So how in the world do you use this guy? Well, rule number 1, you use one hand, and it's probably going to be your right hand, to type, and that's it. Similar to the typewriter, you insert a piece of paper between the roll and the letter port. The letter port is identified by the red arrow that you see up there, and it's a grid of 72 holes that have a combination of common letters and symbols that you'd find on a typewriter. The yellow arrow on the screen points to what is called the stylus. One simply moves the stylus over to the desired letter, you press it in, and by magic of the internal workings, it appears on your piece of paper. Other exciting features include a space bar. Well, it's more like a space square, actually. It's the green arrow that you see down on the bottom. And then there's things like the carriage returns and margins that we see in standard typewriters as well. Well, I don't think I'm surprising anybody when I tell you that the index typewriter didn't really take off. Nobody really uses that. The standard typewriter was a little more popular. As you can imagine, typing on the index typewriter was slower than typing on a standard keyboard in which you would use two hands. I found a great article that stated that users of the Hall typewriter would have typed about 35 words per minute, compared to a standard typewriter, they were typing about 65 words per minute because they're using two hands, easier to use. Thomas Hall did transfer to making standard typewriters. I think it was the Century brand typewriters, but unfortunately he was not as successful as he was with his index typewriter. And Mr. Hall dies in 1911 at the age of 77. Final object I like to discuss is this beautiful, beautiful silk cape that we have here in the collection. The colors are just amazing. It's exquisite. And I think this was the first object in the collection that I fell in love with. I came across it as a recommendation from some of the collections volunteers when we were planning a small pop-up exhibit at the Magnolia Luncheon last year that Pinellas County Historical Society puts on. And we were putting together a list of great textile pieces that would look great for our members, and they suggested this cape. And I said, okay. I took their suggestion and I started researching this cape. And surprisingly, our existing file had a really great starting point. This particular cape belonged to Elizabeth Lamont Mitchell Whitney. Now, admittedly, as far as I know, this cape does not have a connection to Pinellas County. Now, I warned you that we do have these things that pop up in our collection, but I'm telling you, this cape is really, really interesting, and we are very fortunate to have it in our collection. So like I said, the story is really fascinating, and I want to share with all of you, but I will warn you that the story is not for the faint of heart. Its history is frighteningly real and sad and a little dark. But nonetheless, it's still history, and I still want to share it with you. So as you can see from the photograph, the cape has 3 labels sewn into the inside that provide great clues to its history. The one on the far left says, worn by Elizabeth Lamont Mitchell Whitney at Buchanan's inaugural ball. Next to that, it reads, Mrs. W.E. Turple, 25 Harvard Street, Worcester, Massachusetts. And finally, the third label simply says Mildred Gauntlet. I wish all objects came with this information. It would really make our lives a lot easier. It provides a great starting point for us. But even with these names, we don't really necessarily know the history, but it's a great place to start. So who was Elizabeth Lamont Mitchell Whitney? That's not her, by the way. Not her. She was born in Leeds, Maine in 1827 to William and Abigail Mitchell. She was also known as Betsy, and at some point in the late 1850s married a Mr. Melvin S. Whitney. Mr. Whitney had been married before to Sarah Langley, and together they had an adopted daughter. And I tell you this because it becomes important later on in the story. So remember Sarah and their daughter. So back to Elizabeth and Melvin, they marry and they reside in New York City. Melvin works as a merchant. He's actually a wine merchant. He's a banker, and he is very, very successful. He was on the board of several banks and large institutions, and spent most of his work career right on Wall Street. It's through his financial and business success that I believe that allowed him to receive an invitation to the inaugural ball of President James Buchanan, seen on the right. So that's President Buchanan in 1857, which he attended with his wife, Elizabeth. The photograph on the left depicts the inauguration of President Buchanan, and it's believed to be the earliest photograph of a presidential inauguration. So if you're ever at trivia, now you know that you learned at Heritage Village, President Buchanan. On the right, you'll see the invitation to the ball that was held March 4th, 1857, and it was at this ball that Elizabeth wore that beautiful cape. The illustration seen here was originally published in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. The inaugural ball was held in a temporary structure that was built on Judiciary Square and reportedly cost $15,000 to construct. The temporary building had 2 rooms, one for dancing and one for eating. It's only the rooms you need when you go to a party, right? Some 5,000 guests attended the ball and dined on oysters, chicken salad, jellies, ice cream, all sorts of meats, and of course, all to be washed down by the finest wine. I have no doubt that Elizabeth and her husband had a great time. But what happened to Elizabeth and Melvin after the inaugural ball, after the cape is worn? Well, Elizabeth and Melvin have a daughter in 1863, and they name her Ozier Whitney. Ozier, O-Z-A-Y-I-E-R, unique name. 2 years after the birth of her daughter, Elizabeth's world changes quite dramatically. As I mentioned, Mr. Whitney was in the banking business, and by this time, he had made a couple of poor decisions that threatened to ruin him financially. The details aren't really clear, but a lot of articles that I found mention that Mr. Whitney took on a new business partner. He was a young man that actually lived with them in their New York City home, and this partner made a series of poor financial decisions. Now, there is speculation that this young gentleman purposely made those poor decisions to ruin him financially. Others believe that it was accidental. Either way, these poor decisions caused a lot of stress to Mr. Whitney, mentally, physically, and financially. And on January 18th, 1865, Mr. Whitney committed suicide with a razor to his throat in the bathroom of his home on Broad Street, roughly 15 minutes after Elizabeth, his wife, had left him to go downstairs and eat breakfast. And he was found by one of his servants later on. Now, newspaper articles from that time depict his detail of his suicide, which I will not share with you, but I imagine it was covered so widely in the papers and in such great detail because he was a well-known businessman. And according to one journalist, he said that he was one of the most respectable citizens in New York City. Mr. Whitney left behind 2 children, and he was only 53 years old. Unfortunately, it gets a little worse for Elizabeth. Melvin Whitney, very successful businessman, didn't think to update his will after he married a second time and had a child. His will provided for his first wife, Sarah, she's come back around, and their adopted daughter, Elizabeth, which is slightly confusing. And he also provided for his housekeeper, also named Elizabeth, I can't make this up, to take care of his adopted daughter financially. So Elizabeth doesn't get anything. Ex-wife gets something, and the daughter and the housekeeper. And it was really interesting doing all this research when all the Elizabeths keep popping up and you're trying to figure out who is who. I don't know what happened to Elizabeth and her daughter Ozier between 1865 and 1900. In terms of the records that are available, she kind of disappears. But she does pop up again in 1900, and we find her living with her daughter in Maine. Ozier has married at this time, and she is married to a gentleman named William Turple. Name probably sounds familiar, and they have 2 children. So if you remember the labels that are sewn inside the cape, the second one was a Mrs. W.E. Turple listed on there, and that's her daughter. As for the third label, Mildred Gauntlet, I don't know who that is, and I don't know how she's related to Elizabeth Whitney and her story. More research needs to be done on that, and believe me, I really wanted to find out who Mildred was, but I don't know yet. So there's a road ahead that we can follow, and hopefully I'll find out one day. As for Elizabeth, she dies in 1903 in Massachusetts of senile decay and heart failure. Now, I realize that that isn't the most romantic and lighthearted story to end with, but I love the story nonetheless. When I uncovered this history, I kept saying to myself, gosh, all of this from one simple cape that I wanted to put on display. And And the answer is yes, and that's the best part of working at a museum. We have the distinct privilege of caring for objects that have incredible stories and journeys, just like people throughout history. And like the history of people, an object's history isn't always glamorous and happy. But as caretakers of these objects, it's our responsibility to preserve them and to ensure their stories, whether they're sad or happy or somewhere in between, are still told and shared with visitors. If we don't do that, well, then I'm not really sure what our purpose here is, right? So now that you've seen some of the highlights of the collection, I hope that when you think of Heritage Village, these objects come to mind, along with all of the things you see here. The magic of Heritage Village includes our buildings, our exhibits, our amazing staff and volunteers, and our collection, even the objects hidden inside endless rows of acid-free boxes. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming out this afternoon, and we do have time for a few questions if anybody has any. Yes, ma'am.
When, if ever, you are going to have a walkthrough or whatever of all these stored items, I would be very interested.
Oh, yes, yes. Yes, that is an interesting thing that we could offer, absolutely. You know, I love taking people into our storage area. I think it's a behind-the-scenes offering that people get to see that we're actively trying to preserve our collection. And it's also a really great vision to see how museums do what we do behind the scenes, which is just as important as to what we do on the front lines, too. So yes, I will keep that in mind. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Where was the Oak Grove Dairy located?
It was on Drew Street. I don't know. I should have looked for the cross streets, but I know it was on Drew Street in the Clearwater area. Yes, ma'am.
Do you do your own genealogical research about some of these objects, or do you have someone else that helps you with that?
Well, for these particular objects, I did them myself. And usually that's what I would do. When we have a new curator on staff in a few weeks or so, as she researches objects, she'll do that all herself. We also rely on our volunteers. We have some great collections volunteers that help with sort of the history that I'm not really familiar with, like the Hall typewriter, for example, and in terms of how it's working and all of that. I'm not a mechanic, so in terms of learning that, we rely on our volunteers to do that. So it's actually a really great teamwork and team effort. Yes, ma'am.
In regards to the last cape that you talked about, how did that come to the village?
That's an interesting question. Someone donated it to us. We have the individual's name, but there's no history in terms of, you know, I got this cape from so-and-so. The only clues we had were the labels that were sewn on the inside. My guess is that the donor and Mildred Gauntlet, who we don't know who that is, are probably descendants of Elizabeth's, but that's speculation. I'm not really sure. Anything else? Yes, sir.
You said you didn't mention on the sewing machine when you originally introduced or mentioned the sewing machine. You said it was seized up. And then the second picture, you said that you see a piece of material there.
Yeah.
And you said it was working.
It was working.
So it was. You actually made it. You actually got inside it. And
our volunteer.
Got it to work.
The same volunteer who helped me with the typewriter worked on the sewing machine and got it functioning again. We were able to get it to move because when we pulled it out, it wouldn't even turn, nothing. So we added a belt and were able to get it to function again, which is really incredible. I love that. Yes, ma'am.
I think everybody would agree with me. We vote for a sequel.
Oh. Thank you. Yes. Our collection is so abundant that I would love to do a What I Love Part 2 because we have some really great stuff. So I appreciate that. Yes, sir.
Any connection between what you're doing here and what the Pinellas Genealogical Society does in Largo in terms of looking up backgrounds of people and their ancestors and things like that?
Well, are you, if we do that together, or?
Are there times when you can do that and
Sure.
trace things that you couldn't trace otherwise?
Absolutely. I mean, we could certainly go to other resources, other groups, because the great thing is that we are very fortunate to have a lot of groups like that in Pinellas County, and so we can all rely on each other to find out those histories and those trails where they lead. So absolutely, yes. Well, again, thank you so much for coming out today, and I hope you really enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all next month.